Now we're going to be looking at a new data structure, which we haven't seen before, which are called tuples, or as some people like to call them, tuples. Um, Whatever you call them, tuples are essentially another way to store multiple elements. Remember, a list is just a way to store multiple elements. The difference that's key between tuples and lists is that tuples are immutable. Now, this is a very key property of lists that has led to a lot of things like aliasing, but also led to things like destructive and non-destructive functions, right? The reason that these things arise is because of the mutability of lists. However, tuples are immutable, so a lot of those things don't apply. So first of all, let's talk about how to actually make a tuple. Now, making a tuple is simple enough. It looks like making a list, except instead of brackets, you use parentheses. So if I want to make the list containing 3, 4, 5, I make parentheses 3, 4, 5. Now if I print out the type, the length, and actual t, notice it's a class of tuple. It has 3 elements, and it's a list, the tuple containing 1, 2, 3. Another way that we can make tuples is that we can take a list which we have and just use the tuple function, which will essentially take the list and turn it into a tuple. So once again, we can see that it's the list turned into a tuple. It has the length 3, and it is a tuple. Now let's examine some code which actually shows us how its tuples are immutable. So I create a tuple t, and I print out the first element, which is 1. However, now notice that I try to make the 0th element equal to 42. Now, in a list, we can do this operation because lists are mutable. I can change the values inside of a list. However, since tuples are immutable, I cannot make the 0th element 42. This should remind you of another data structure we saw, which are strings. If I have the string s equals a, b, c, d, I cannot do s of 0 is equal to z. This would also crash. If I run this code, it says string object does not support item assignment because strings are immutable. Tuples are exactly the same. I cannot make the 0th element 42 because it's an immutable object. Another nice thing that we can do with tuples is something called parallel assignment. Now let's say that I have a bunch of variables and I want to set them, or a bunch of values, and I want to put them into variables. Now, one way that I could do this is I could say x equals 1, y equals 2, z equals 3. However, this takes a lot of code, or a lot of lines of code, and it doesn't really get us anything for the lots of lines that we write. So what you can do is actually say the tuple x, y, z is equal to the tuple 1, 2, and 3. And essentially what it does is it takes the lists, it creates variables x, y, z, and sets them equal to the values 1, 2, and 3. Another thing to note is that when you do tuple assignments, it actually calculates all the values first and then assigns them. So let's say I say ab is equal to x plus 5, or I'll say x is equal to x plus 5, and then I'll say b is equal to x. Now, x is essentially being incremented by 5, and b is just being set to x. However, because it calculates all of these things first, it'll take the current value of x, which is 1, and calculate this to be 6 and this to be 1. So, when I set b equal to x, it's not the new value of x with 5 added, it's the old value. So now, if I print tuple of x, b, it'll give me 6 and 1 instead of 6 and 5. Now, previously we looked at how swapping was something which isn't as straightforward as we would like. If I have the variable x is equal to 5 and y is equal to 7, and I want to say x should be 7 and y should be 5, this required us to make a temporary variable and stuff like this. However, with tuple assignment, you can do this very easily. You basically want to take x and y and say that these values are now y is equal to x and x is equal to y. Notice here it says y is the value of x and x is the value of y. Now because of the reasons we just discussed, that it puts the 5 and the 7 here, this will set the y equal to the 5 and the x equal to the 7 in one fell swoop. So in this way we can do swapping very nice and cleanly. Finally, we'll look at how to make a tuple with one element in them. Now, it's kind of confusing because when you put parentheses around things, it doesn't always mean a tuple. For instance, when we put a parenthesis around a number, this actually is just saying that it's an expression with a number in it. So when I print out t, it's actually an integer, and I multiply it by 5, and it's 42 times 5. If we want to make a tuple with one element, the way that we get around this is that we put the element followed by a comma. This tells Python that this isn't just parentheses, this is actually a tuple. And so now when we print t, it's a tuple containing times 5, 42, 42, and 42. So this was a quick overview of tuples. They're a data structure which become useful when you essentially want to store things that don't need to be changed. And when we talk about dictionaries later on in the course and also sets, you'll see another reason why having an immutable data structure like tuples will be very useful.